The stagecoach rolled into Calico Bluffs on a Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1879, coating the main street in a plume of red dust that settled over the boots of every man who turned to watch. And Gideon Redmond, leaning against the post outside the sheriff's office with his hat pulled low and his arms folded across his chest, felt the fine hairs on the back of his neck rise before the door of the coach had even swung open. He had learned to pay attention to that feeling. In 12 years of working as a deputy in 3 different territories, that particular sensation had never once lied to him. It was the feeling that came before a man drew a gun, or before a fire started in a barn 3 streets over, or before news arrived that changed the shape of everything a person thought they understood about their own life. He straightened his back and pushed his hat up with one thumb, watching the door of the coach the way a man watches the surface of water when something is moving beneath it. The door opened, and a woman stepped down. She was wearing a blue dress with a white collar, practical and well-made but not new, the kind of dress that had traveled far and seen weather. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up under a small hat that tilted slightly to the left as though the journey had knocked it loose. She carried a single leather traveling bag that looked heavier than she made it appear. She was somewhere in her mid-20s, with a steady, deliberate quality to the way she moved that told Gideon she was accustomed to arriving in places where she was not known and making the best of it. He knew her. He knew her before she turned her face in his direction. He knew her before her eyes found him and then deliberately moved away, the way a person looks away from something they are afraid of recognizing. He knew her the way a man knows a song he has not heard in years but never actually forgot. Her name was not whatever name she had given to the stagecoach company. He was almost certain of that. He watched her cross the dusty street toward the hotel, watched her pause at the door and then go inside, and he stood there for a long moment with the dust still settling around him, and the afternoon sun pressing down on the back of his neck, turning over everything he thought he knew and fitting the pieces together in a new arrangement that made a kind of painful, inevitable sense. Gideon Redmond was 31 years old. He had been born in Missouri, raised in Kansas after his family moved west when he was 9, and had come to the Arizona Territory 4 years ago when Sheriff Walt Coggins had offered him the deputy's position. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that people consistently underestimated because they were quiet eyes, the kind that watched and waited and gave nothing away until the watching was done. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a man who thought things through, sometimes longer than was comfortable until he was sure. He was sure about this woman. He waited until the following morning to go to the hotel. The hotel was called the Bluffs Rest, a 2-story wooden building with a wide porch where old Hector Maine sat most days in a rocking chair, claiming to be keeping watch but generally sleeping. The lobby smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, and the lemon oil that the owner, Clara Drummond, used on all the wooden surfaces with great dedication. Clara was at the front desk when Gideon came in, and she gave him the look she gave everyone who came in before 9 in the morning, which was a look of measured suspicion. "Morning, deputy," Clara said. "Morning, Clara. You have a new guest checked in yesterday afternoon." Clara's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. Clara Drummond was 53 years old and had run this hotel since her husband passed 8 years ago, and she had developed an extremely reliable instinct for when something unusual was happening in her establishment. "I have a few guests," she said carefully. "Woman traveling alone, dark hair, blue dress." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said she signed in as Eudora Keating. The name landed in the room between them like a stone dropped in still water. Gideon let it sit for a moment. "Did she?" "That's what she wrote in the book." Clara paused. "Is there a problem with her, Gideon?" "No problem," he said. "I'd just like to speak with her if she's willing." Clara studied him for a moment longer, then nodded toward the small dining room off the lobby where guests took their breakfast. "She comes down about this time. You could wait." He sat at one of the tables near the window with a cup of coffee that Clara poured for him without asking, and he waited. He had been sitting there about 12 minutes when he heard footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, and then she came through the doorway into the dining room and stopped when she saw him. The moment stretched between them like a held breath. She was wearing a gray dress today, simpler than the blue one, and her hair was down around her shoulders. In the morning light he could see more clearly what he had only half seen the day before, and every detail confirmed what he already knew. She was older than she had been, of course. 7 years was a long time, but the line of her jaw, the way she held her chin, the particular steadiness of her dark eyes, none of that had changed. "Miss Keating," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Something crossed her face too quickly to name. She came the rest of the way into the dining room and sat down across from him, setting her hands flat on the table, and looked at him directly. Up close, he could see that she was tired in a deep way that had nothing to do with yesterday's journey. She had the look of someone who had been tired for a long time. "Deputy Redmond," she said. His name in her mouth was both familiar and strange, like a room he had not been in for a long time. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "That's not your name," he said quietly. "Eudora Keating." She did not flinch. She held his gaze without blinking. "It is now," she said. "The Eudora Keating I knew," Gideon said carefully, "died in Dodge City in the winter of 1875. There was a funeral. I was not there, but I was told about it, and the telling was specific. The woman across from him was quiet for a long time." The morning sounds of the hotel moved around them. Someone moving in the kitchen, Hector Maines on the porch outside, beginning to snore. Finally she said, "The woman who was buried under that name was Eudora Keating. She was my cousin. She was 24 years old and she had been sick for almost a year." She paused. "When she died, I took her name. I had very good reasons for doing so, and I would appreciate it if you did not ask me to explain them in a hotel dining room." Gideon looked at her steadily. "Then who are you?" She met his eyes. "I was born Miriam Lacy." The air went out of the room. Miriam Lacy. He had known a girl named Miriam Lacy in Abilene, Kansas in 1872. He had been 24 years old and working his first real deputy position under a sheriff named Hal Pierce, and Miriam Lacy had been 18, the daughter of a cattle rancher named James Lacy, whose land bordered the eastern edge of town. She had been quick-tongued and clever and entirely unimpressed by badges or authority, and she had made him laugh more in the 6 months he had known her than he had laughed in the 3 years before or after. He had been falling in love with her in the slow, certain way that he did most things, one step at a time, building a careful foundation, when her father had moved the family to Colorado without warning or much explanation, and Miriam had gone with them because she was 18 and had no real choice, and Gideon had watched the wagon pull away and told himself that he would write and that it would work out somehow, and then it had not. He had written twice. The letters had not been answered. He had told himself that was an answer in itself, and he had put it away and kept working, and 7 years had passed in the way that years pass when a person is focused on the work in front of them without ceremony or announcement. He had not thought about Miriam Lacy in at least 3 years. He was almost certain of that. "Miriam," he said, and her name in his mouth was different from the false name. It had weight and texture and history, and she closed her eyes briefly as though it had touched something. "Please keep your voice down," she said. "Why?" He kept his voice low but not soft. "Who is it that you're running from?" Her eyes opened. She looked at him across the table with the kind of directness that he had always associated with her, even after 7 years, and she said, "My husband." The silence that followed was not the kind that could be filled quickly. Gideon picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. He looked at the window for a moment, at the morning light on the street outside where 2 men were loading a wagon and a dog was investigating something near the base of the water trough. He looked back at her. "You're married," he said. "I was," she said. "Robert Calloway. I married him in Colorado in 1874 when I was 20 and he seemed like a decent man." She paused. "He was not a decent man. He was a controlling, frightening, dangerous man who did not become fully apparent to me until about 6 months after the wedding, and by then I was in a situation that was very difficult to leave. Gideon kept his face still, but something was shifting and settling in his chest, some kind of cold fury moving quietly through him that he recognized as the kind of anger he felt when injustice was being done to someone who did not deserve it. He had seen enough of the world to know that what she was describing was not uncommon, that women married men who turned dangerous and then found themselves trapped inside lives that had no official exits, that the law in 1879 offered very little protection to a woman in that situation, and that the only real option available to many of them was to disappear. "When your cousin died," he said, "it was the first real opportunity I had seen in 4 years," she said steadily. "Eudora had no close family other than me. She was not married. She had no children. She had been ill for so long that she had no real community, no close friends in Dodge City who would notice quickly that someone was different. I paid for her burial, I arranged everything, and I took her name and her papers and I left." She paused. "Robert believes I am dead. He received a letter telling him so, and there was a grave to visit if he chose to. As far as I know, he accepted it." "As far as you know," Gideon repeated. Something moved across her face. "I received information a few weeks ago, from a woman I had been corresponding with in Denver, someone I trusted. She told me that Robert had hired a man to look into the circumstances of Eudora's death, that he was not satisfied with what he had been told. She said he seemed suspicious. So you left wherever you were and came here." "I have been moving," she said quietly. "I was in New Mexico for 2 years, then briefly in Texas. I came here because I needed a place to stop. I cannot keep moving indefinitely. I needed somewhere small enough that a stranger passing through would be noticed, but connected enough that I could find work." She paused. "I needed somewhere that felt safe." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. There was something about the way she had said that last word, safe, that told him how long it had been since she had felt it. He thought about the girl in Abilene who had made him laugh, who had argued with him about cattle law with a passion that had been completely out of proportion to the stakes, who had ridden better than most men he knew, and never once seemed to need anyone's approval for anything. He thought about what 4 years of a bad marriage and 4 more years of running could do to a person who had once been that free. "You can't stay under a stolen name," he said. "Not forever." "I know," she said. "If there's a man looking for you and he's good at it, a name doesn't provide as much protection as you might think. I know that too. What is it that you're hoping for coming here?" She looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "I don't entirely know. I saw the posting for a seamstress position in the dry goods store when I was making decisions. I know how to sew. I thought perhaps if I worked honestly and kept my head down and was careful, I might build something that could last more than 6 months." She paused, and I recognized the name of the town from letters. He went still. "My letters. You wrote to me twice," she said. "You mentioned Calico Bluffs in both of them. You said it was a place you might settle eventually, that you liked the landscape." She paused. I held on to that. It seemed foolish, but I held on to it. The dining room felt very small and very bright all of a sudden. Gideon became aware of the sound of Clara moving in the kitchen, of the creak of the old building settling in the morning heat, of his own heartbeat which had been slightly unsteady since the moment she sat down across from him. "You held on to it," he said carefully. "I had your letters for a long time," she said, and there was something careful and exposed in her voice, the way a person sounds when they are saying something they have never said aloud before. "I read them many times before I had to burn them. Robert went through everything I kept." The cold, quiet fury moved through him again. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her carefully, trying to separate what he knew from what he felt. The same discipline he applied to everything, the measured, methodical way he approached the world. But underneath the discipline there was something that was not disciplined at all, something that had recognized her before she turned her face toward him, something that had apparently been waiting for 7 years without his full knowledge or consent. "All right," he said. She looked at him cautiously. "All right, what?" "All right, I'm not going to tell anyone what you've told me," he said. "Not today. I want to think about how to handle this properly, and I want to understand more about the situation before I make any decisions. But in the meantime, you should know that I am not your enemy in this." She held his gaze for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, weighing him, applying the same kind of careful assessment to him that he had just applied to her. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, and there was a genuine quality to it that told him she had not said those words easily for a long time. She got the position at the dry goods store. The store was owned by a man named Frank Aldridge, who was in his 50s and ran his business with great precision and not much warmth, and who hired Eudora Keating, as she called herself, because he had seen her work, and it was genuinely excellent. She could take in a coat or let out a dress with a speed and neatness that impressed even Frank, who was not easily impressed. Within 2 weeks, she had a small, regular clientele of women who brought their mending and their alterations to her, and Frank had given her a corner of the back room with good light where she set up her work. Gideon watched from a careful distance for the first week. He told himself he was being thorough, that his job was the safety of the town and everyone in it, that paying attention to new arrivals was simply professional practice. He told himself this convincingly enough that he believed it for almost 7 days before he stopped pretending. He started finding reasons to visit the dry goods store. The first time, he needed a button replaced on his work shirt, which was true, and he brought it in on a Tuesday morning and left it with Eudora and came back for it on Thursday. She handed it to him with the button replaced and 2 others that had been loose-tightened without being asked, and he turned the shirt over in his hands and said, "You didn't have to do the others." "They were about to go," she said simply. "It would have been a waste not to." He paid her and left, and he walked back to the sheriff's office with the shirt under his arm and the feeling that he was already in very serious trouble. The second time, the following week, he had no real reason at all, and he came in under the pretense of speaking with Frank about an incident involving a broken window, which was a real incident, and stayed 15 minutes longer than necessary, because Eudora came through from the back room with a bolt of calico fabric over one arm, and they ended up discussing the best techniques for stitching leather, which she had been experimenting with for a saddle repair commission. And she had opinions about it that were specific and interesting and entirely unexpected. And Gideon found himself leaning against the store counter with his arms folded and his hat pushed back, thoroughly engaged in a conversation about leather work at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, as though this was a perfectly normal use of his time. She laughed at something he said. It was a short, slightly surprised laugh, the kind that escapes a person before they decide whether to let it, and the sound of it did something extremely inconvenient to Gideon's chest. He left the store shortly after that and spent the afternoon doing his rounds with unusual concentration. The town of Calico Bluffs had approximately 400 residents in 1879, which made it small enough that a person knew most faces and large enough that new ones were not a source of overwhelming excitement. It had a main street with the hotel, the dry goods store, a saloon called the Red Saddle, a barber, a blacksmith whose name was Louis Garza and who was widely considered the most competent person in town, a doctor named Dr. Theodore Hale who was young and serious and very good, and a schoolhouse at the north end of the street that was taught by a woman named Margaret Price, who had come from Ohio and had no intention of going back. There was a church, naturally, and a small jail that saw moderate use, and the sheriff's office which Gideon shared with Sheriff Walt Coggins, who was 58 years old and had been doing this job for longer than most people in town had been alive, and intended to keep doing it until he physically could not. Walt Coggins was also the sharpest observer Gideon had ever worked with, which became a problem approximately 3 weeks after Eudora Keating arrived in Calico Bluffs. They were sitting in the office after the morning rounds, Walt with his feet on the desk and his hat over his face in his habitual afternoon rest position, and Gideon was writing up a report on a property dispute between two ranchers when Walt said without moving his hat, "You've been going to the dry goods store a lot." Gideon did not look up from his writing. "Button problems." A pause. "The seamstress." "Frank Aldridge's seamstress," Gideon said carefully. "Yes." Walt was quiet for a moment. "She seems like a capable woman," he said. "Mrs. Fenton was telling me last week that she'd had a dress altered that had been giving her trouble for years, and this woman fixed it in an afternoon." "She's skilled," Gideon said. "Quiet, keeps to herself mostly." Walt shifted in his chair, "but not unfriendly. Clara Drummond likes her, and Clara doesn't like anyone in the first 3 months as a general rule." "Clara is particular," Gideon agreed. "She have family anywhere." The pen in Gideon's hand moved steadily across the page. "Not that she's mentioned to me." Walt lifted his hat and looked at Gideon with one eye. "She mentioned things to you." "In conversation," Gideon said. "In passing." Walt put his hat back over his face. "Right," he said, in the tone of a man who has all the information he needs and does not require further commentary. Gideon finished his report and said nothing more about it. He did not talk to Eudora again at length until a Sunday afternoon in September, about 5 weeks after her arrival, when he came across her sitting on the bank of the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town, with her shoes off and her feet in the water, and a book open in her lap that she had apparently stopped reading in favor of watching a pair of herons on the opposite bank. He almost turned around and left her to her solitude because she looked more at peace than he had yet seen her, and he was reluctant to disturb that. But she heard his footsteps on the path and looked up, and whatever decision he had been about to make was overtaken by the fact that she looked directly at him and said, "Come sit down. There are herons." He sat. He took his boots off because the afternoon was warm and the creek water looked cool, and because she had done it and it seemed rude not to. He put his feet in the water and they sat in companionable silence for several minutes watching the herons, who were fishing with the particular unhurried intensity of birds who have no doubt at all that the world will provide what they need. "I have been thinking," she said eventually, "about what you said, about the name." He waited. "You said I cannot stay under a stolen name forever," she said. "You were right. I know you were right." She turned the book over in her lap without looking at it. "But the practical problem is that my legal name connects me to Robert, and as long as he is alive and looking, that name is a danger." "Divorce is possible," Gideon said carefully. "Difficult but not impossible." She gave a short, not entirely humorless sound. "On what grounds and through which courts? Robert is a man with money and connections in Colorado. He would simply contest it and the process would announce my location to him, which is the one thing I cannot afford." "Then we would need to think about it differently," Gideon said. He had been turning this problem over in his mind for weeks without arriving at an obvious solution, and he was honest enough to say so rather than pretend otherwise. "I don't have a clean answer yet." She looked at him. "I appreciate that you say that instead of a reassurance you can't back up. I make it a practice not to promise what I can't deliver." "That is a rarer quality than it should be," she said. They were quiet again. One of the herons struck into the water and came up with a fish, and they both watched the brief, efficient drama of it. The afternoon light on the creek was amber and gold, the kind of light that made everything look like a painting of itself. "Tell me about the last 7 years," she said. "If you want to," he told her. He told her about Kansas, and then New Mexico, and then arriving in the Arizona Territory. About the work and the landscape and the particular quality of the desert in different seasons. About the cases that had interested him and the ones that had exhausted him. About the quiet accumulation of a life that was meaningful and sometimes lonely, but that he had never quite been willing to call insufficient. He was honest about the loneliness the way he was honest about most things, not dwelling on it but not pretending it hadn't been there. She listened with the kind of attention that is genuinely rare, the kind where a person is not preparing what they will say next but actually taking in what is being said, and when he finished, she sat with it for a moment before she spoke. "It sounds like a life that has been built with care," she said. "I suppose it has. What about yours? She was quiet for a moment. Mine has been built with survival, she said, which is a different kind of building entirely. Everything I have done since 1874 has been about getting through, finding the next safe place, learning who to trust and who not to, keeping myself from being found. She paused. I am tired of building things that way. I want to build something that is not just a wall. What would you build instead? She looked at the herons on the opposite bank, which had gone back to their patient fishing. Something real, she said finally. A real name, a real place, real work that I do not always have to be ready to leave behind. A pause, real connections. Gideon looked at his feet in the clear water. He thought about something she had said weeks ago in the hotel dining room, about holding onto a name in a letter, about coming here because it had seemed like a place that felt safe. He thought about the feeling he had had when the stagecoach door had opened, that particular rising of the fine hairs on the back of his neck that had never once lied to him. He thought about her laugh in the dry goods store, short and surprised and real. I would like to keep talking to you, he said. Like this, if that is something you would want. She turned and looked at him, and the light was doing something to her face that made it difficult to maintain the measured, professional distance he had been attempting for 5 weeks. I would like that, she said. He put his boots back on. She put her shoes back on. They walked back along the path toward town together, not quite close enough for their arms to touch, but close enough that the possibility of it was there with them the whole way, like a third companion that neither of them acknowledged aloud. The man arrived on a Friday at the beginning of October. Gideon saw him from across the street, a stocky man with a brown hat and a light gray coat, the kind of coat that was slightly too heavy for Arizona in October, and that suggested the man had come from somewhere further north without entirely adjusting for it. He was talking to the stagecoach driver, asking questions with the manner of a man who asks questions professionally, not aggressive, just thorough and methodical and quietly persistent. Gideon had seen that manner before. He had used it himself. The man went to the hotel first, then the saloon, then the barber shop. He was not in any hurry. He moved with the particular patience of someone who had been doing this for a long time and knew that patience produced better results than urgency. Gideon followed him at a distance, learning his route, then cut ahead and went directly to the dry goods store. Eudora was in the back room with a skirt she was hemming when he came through the rear door. She looked up and saw his face, and the needle in her hand went still. Someone is in town asking questions, he said quietly. I don't know yet who sent him or what specifically he is looking for, but I want you to go to Clara Drummond's and stay there for the rest of the day. Not the hotel, Clara's private residence. Use the back door. She set the skirt down and stood up. Her face had gone very still, the stillness that he had come to recognize as what she did instead of showing fear. How long do I have? He's at the saloon. He'll be at the barber shop next, then the general store, and then here probably. You have maybe 20 minutes. She did not argue or ask more questions. She untied her work apron, folded it on the table, gathered the small bag she kept with her, and said, What will you tell him if he asks about me? Nothing yet, Gideon said. Let me find out what he knows first. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that were still and direct and deep and said, Be careful with him. He will seem reasonable. He registered that piece of information and filed it. Go, he said. She went. He went back out through the front of the store, nodded to Frank Aldridge, and went back across the street to the sheriff's office, where he made himself sit at his desk and look like a man who had been there all morning. Walt Coggins came in from his rounds 20 minutes later, and Gideon told him what he had observed, keeping it factual and leaving out everything about Eudora that was not strictly relevant to the immediate situation. Walt listened with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes on the middle distance. You know this man? He asked. No, but I know the type. Private inquiry agent, most likely, or a hired man of a similar kind. Walt was quiet for a moment. If someone has sent a man looking for a person in my town, he said, I'd like to know why and on whose behalf before that man finds what he's looking for." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Gideon said. The man came to the sheriff's office mid-afternoon. His name, he said, was Clarence Webb, and he was pleasant and straightforward and explained that he was making inquiries on behalf of a private client, a matter of family concern, and he was looking for any information about a woman who might have passed through or taken up residence recently. A woman in her mid to late 20s, dark hair, traveling alone. Walt asked him a series of questions with the mild, unhurried manner that had fooled more people than Gideon could count, and Clarence Webb answered them with a practiced openness that was professional enough to be slightly transparent if you knew what you were looking at. He did not reveal his client's name. He said it was a family matter and that the woman in question was not in any trouble, simply a relation who had been lost track of and whose family wished to know she was well. Gideon sat in the corner and watched Clarence Webb the way he had been taught to watch people, looking not at what was said, but at what was not, at the small adjustments of posture and expression that told the story running under the one being spoken aloud. Clarence Webb was telling approximately half the truth. The woman was real and the search was real, but the concern was not familial and it was not gentle. After Webb left the office with nothing concrete but a promise to return if they heard anything, Walt Coggins was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. "The seamstress," he said. It was not a question. Gideon looked back at him steadily. "She's in trouble," Walt said. "She is in a situation," Gideon said carefully, "that she did not choose, and that is not her fault." Walt was quiet again. He was a man who had been enforcing the law in one form or another for 30 years, and he had the particular quality that the best law officers develop over time, which is the ability to distinguish between the letter of the law and the purpose of it, and to apply judgment where the two did not align. He turned his coffee cup on the desk slowly. "I'd like to hear what she has to say," he said finally. "Directly," Gideon nodded. "I'll bring her in this evening." The meeting between Walt Coggins and Miriam Lacy, who was sitting in Walt's office under the name Eudora Keating, was one of the stranger evenings of Gideon's professional life. She told Walt the story with the same directness she had used with Gideon, without embellishment or unnecessary detail, and Walt listened the way he always listened, without interruption, with the full weight of his considerable attention. When she finished, the oil lamp on the desk threw a circle of warm light over the three of them, and the night was quiet outside. Walt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You used your cousin's name to disappear from a dangerous man." "Yes," she said. "And this man, your husband, has now hired someone to find you." "It appears so." "The man who came to my office today," Walt said, "is a capable operator. He's been in this business long enough to be patient, and patience is the thing that finds people." He paused. "The name you're using is not in itself the problem. The problem is that you cannot be found by this man." She looked at him steadily. "That is correct." Walt looked at Gideon for a moment and then back at her. He leaned back in his chair. "I am going to be direct with you, Miss Keating, because I think you prefer it that way. The legal situation is complicated. If Robert Calloway contests that he has a living wife, you are in a difficult position regardless of what name you are using, because your face is your face and it does not change." He paused. "What I can do is make this town as uninformative as possible to Clarence Webb. A town that knows nothing cannot tell anything, and I can make sure that Mr. Webb is given no particular reason to stay longer than a day or two." "I don't want to bring trouble to this town," she said. "Trouble comes to every town," Walt said, and there was a dry certainty to it that indicated decades of experience. "The question is how it's handled. I've handled worse." He looked at Gideon again. Something passed between them that was not words, the communication of people who have worked together long enough to understand the weight of what is being agreed to. Gideon gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, in the quiet way she had of saying it that made it mean something. Walt walked her out and Gideon stayed in the office, and when Walt came back and sat back down in his chair, he said without preamble, "How long have you known her?" 7 years, Gideon said. "Or I knew her 7 years ago." Walt nodded slowly. I see. Is that going to be a problem? No, Walt said. It answers a question I had about your judgment, but it doesn't make the judgment wrong. A pause. You handle this carefully, Gideon. I intend to. Walt looked at him for a long moment. I mean personally as well as professionally, he said. Then he put his hat on and said he was going home for supper, and that was the end of the conversation. Clarence Webb stayed 2 more days. The town was uniformly unhelpful to him, not in an obvious way that would attract attention, but in the genuine way of a small community that has collectively decided to offer nothing beyond the minimum courtesy. He got a room at the hotel, where Clara Drummond was so completely, pleasantly, unremarkably ordinary that she gave him nothing to work with. He visited the saloon where the evening crowd was friendly and talkative about cattle and weather, and nothing relevant. He came back to the sheriff's office once more and spoke again with Walt, who was regretful and thorough and entirely uninformative. On his 3rd morning, Webb saddled up and rode out, and Gideon watched him go from the doorway of the office and felt something ease in his chest. He told Eudora that evening. She was at Clara's still, where Clara had given her the spare room at the back of the house and had developed, in the way Clara developed opinions about people, a protectiveness toward her that was entirely natural and slightly fierce. Eudora thanked him and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "He will send someone else." "Probably not for a while," Gideon said. "And we will be ready." He noticed that he said we without deciding to, and she noticed it too, and neither of them mentioned it. She moved back to the hotel the next day, and the following week she resumed her work at the dry goods store, and the town of Calico Bluffs went back to its ordinary rhythms. And if anything between Eudora Keating and Deputy Gideon Redmond had shifted and deepened in the weeks since her arrival, it did so quietly and without announcement, the way the most important changes tend to happen. October became November. The evenings turned cold and the days stayed bright and sharp-edged, the particular clarity of Arizona autumn, and Gideon and Eudora fell into a pattern of walking on Sunday afternoons, following the creek path or the road north of town, or the trail out past the Garza blacksmith toward the low hills where the juniper trees grew thick. They talked about everything. They talked about books and the law and the practicalities of sewing, and what the territory had been like before the railroad changed its shape, and about what home meant to a person who had moved often enough that the word had become theoretical. They talked about her childhood and his, about her father, who had been gentle and somewhat bewildered by her temperament, and his mother, who had been the most practically competent woman he had ever known. They did not talk about the future in explicit terms. They were both, by nature and by the particular education of their experiences, careful people who moved deliberately and did not make promises they could not keep. But the future was present in everything they said, in the way conversations are when 2 people are quietly building something together without deciding to announce it. He brought her a book from the small lending library that Dr. Hale kept at his office, a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that he thought she would like, and that she received with an expression of such genuine pleasure that something in his chest did something complicated and warm. She left a small wrapped package at the sheriff's office one morning in November, a new pair of leather gloves that she had stitched herself from good quality calfskin, his size, which she had simply known, and when he put them on they fit perfectly in the way that only something made specifically for a person can fit. He wore them every day and she never commented on it, and neither did he, but it was between them, quietly, the way a great many things were between them by then. Louis Garza, who was 40 years old and had been born in Sonora, and who had more sense than most people Gideon had met in any territory, told him one morning while Gideon was having a horseshoe replaced, "You are a very patient man, Deputy." Gideon looked at him. "Is that a criticism?" Louis turned the horseshoe over in his enormous hands. "Patience is a virtue," he said mildly, "up to a point." Gideon said nothing, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. On a Sunday in the last week of November, They had walked out to the Juniper Hills and back, and were sitting on the top step of the hotel porch as the light went out of the sky, the stars coming in one by one over the desert, and Eudora was telling him about a letter she had sent to her attorney in New Mexico, a man she trusted, regarding the legal question of her situation and what options he thought might exist. Gideon was listening carefully because the legal question was real and important, but at the same time he was aware of how close she was sitting, and of the warmth of her arm near his, and of the way the lamplight from the hotel window caught the side of her face, and he was finding the combination of all these things somewhat difficult to manage with his usual composure. She finished what she was saying and there was a comfortable silence, and then she said without looking at him, "You recognized me before I even turned around, when the coach arrived." He looked at her. "Yes." "How?" He thought about it for a moment because he wanted to give her an honest answer rather than a simple one. "The way you moved," he said. "The way you carried yourself. There are things about a person that don't change regardless of time or names or circumstances. I think I've known you long enough that I would recognize you in any crowd, under any name, after any number of years." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was both certain and vulnerable at once, and she said, "I came here because of a name in a letter. But I also came here because I wanted to see if what I remembered about you was real. If you were actually the person I remembered, or if I had made you into something in my memory because I needed something to hold on to." "And," he said quietly, "you are exactly the person I remembered," she said. "Possibly more so." He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically or hurriedly but carefully, the way he did everything, and she turned her hand over in his and held it back with the same care, and they sat like that on the hotel porch under the November stars with the lamplight on their faces and the desert quiet around them for a long time before either of them spoke again. "Whatever needs to be resolved," he said eventually, "we will resolve it together." She leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, a small motion, and said, "I am beginning to believe that." December arrived with cold nights and occasional ice on the water trough in the mornings, and the town took on the particular quality of a place preparing for winter, wood stacked high against the buildings and heavy coats appearing on the main street, and the smell of pine resin coming from the schoolhouse where the children had decorated for Christmas. Dr. Hale hosted a gathering at his office for the regular townspeople, and Walt Coggins made his annual appearance in the good coat that he wore twice a year, and Louis Garza brought his wife Alina and their 3 children, and Margaret Price brought a fruitcake of heroic proportions, and Clara Drummond brought her excellent shortbread. And Gideon arrived with Eudora on his arm, and understood from the specific quality of the silence that fell, and then reformed around them, that this was not a surprise to anyone and had perhaps been expected for some time. Margaret Price took the opportunity to tell Eudora that she thought it was wonderful, and Clara Drummond patted Gideon on the arm once with the air of a woman whose opinion of the situation was thoroughly good, and Walt Coggins shook Gideon's hand for no obvious occasion and said absolutely nothing, which said everything. The letter from the attorney in New Mexico arrived on the 12th of December. Eudora brought it to Gideon in the evening, sitting at his desk in the office while Walt made himself absent with great diplomacy, and they read it together. The attorney, a man named Solomon Fitch who had 20 years of experience in territorial law, had done considerable research. The substance of his letter was this: the grounds for divorce in Colorado were limited but not non-existent. More relevantly, the territory of Arizona had its own courts and its own procedures, and there was a legal argument to be made under territorial law for the dissolution of a marriage contracted under coercion, which required evidence but which was not impossible. Additionally, there was the question of whether Robert Calloway had accepted the evidence of his wife's death, in which case he had, functionally if not legally, relinquished his claim. And finally, there was the possibility of an annulment on grounds of fraud, since the marriage had been entered under materially false representations of character. He thinks it is possible, Eudora said. He thinks it is possible with the right argument in the right court, Gideon said, reading the letter again more carefully. He is not promising easy, but he is not saying impossible. She was quiet for a moment. He says I would need to be prepared to use my real name in the legal process. Yes, Gideon set the letter down, which means Robert would eventually know that you are alive. She looked at the letter on the desk between them. I have been afraid of that for 4 years, she said. I know. He is not a man who accepts defeat easily. I know that too. Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning things over. But a man who hires private investigators is a man who works through legal and semi-legal means. He is not a man who comes himself and does his own dirty work. He paused, which means the best protection you have is not hiding. It is having a situation that is too visible and too official to threat. She looked up at him. There was a question in her eyes that she was not yet asking in words. He looked back at her steadily. I have wanted to ask you something for several weeks, he said. I have been waiting because I wanted to be sure you had enough time and enough safety that the question would not feel pressured, that it would be genuinely your choice. He paused. Miriam. She went very still at the sound of her name, the real one, the one only he used. Marry me, he said. Not as a legal strategy, though it would address the practical problem, and not because of what we were 7 years ago. Because of what we are now, and because I do not want to be a man who goes on building his life without you in it. The lamp on the desk threw its warm circle over them, and the night was cold outside, and the wood in the stove was settling. She looked at him for a long time, and in her face he could see everything she had carried for 4 years, the fear and the exhaustion and the loneliness and the slow, careful rebuilding of something that had been systematically taken apart. And he could see something else underneath all of it, something that had apparently survived everything, the same quality that had made her argue with him about cattle law in Abilene when she was 18 and laugh at his jokes when she was not planning to. Yes, she said. Yes, Gideon. He reached across the desk and took both her hands, and she came around to his side and he stood up and held her, not quickly but slowly, completely. The way a person holds something that is genuinely and carefully precious. And she tucked her face against his shoulder and held on with the same care. And neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said. They were married on a Saturday morning in January of 1880 in the Calico Bluffs church, with Reverend James Milner officiating and the better portion of the town in attendance, because news of this kind travels in a small town with the efficiency of a telegraph. Clara Drummond sat in the front row and looked exactly as pleased as she was. Walt Coggins stood as Gideon's witness and stood very straight in his good coat and shook Gideon's hand again before the ceremony with the expression of a man who is considerably more moved than he intends to show. Louis Garza and Alina sat 3 rows back with the children, and Margaret Price sat beside Clara and held her handkerchief ready, because she was the kind of woman who cried at weddings and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Even Frank Aldridge was there, in the back row, with the expression of a man who is not particularly sentimental, but who recognizes when an occasion demands his presence. Eudora came down the aisle in a dress that she had made herself from a blue wool fabric that she had chosen from Frank's inventory with great deliberation over 3 separate visits, and she was not wearing anyone else's name. She was Miriam, and she was herself, and she walked toward Gideon with a steadiness that had always been hers, and with a light in her face that was entirely new, or perhaps not new, but finally fully visible. Gideon watched her come toward him, and thought that he had been patient for a long time, and that every year of it had been entirely worth the outcome. He took her hand when she reached him, and her hand was warm and steady in his, and Reverend Milner opened his book, and outside the window the January sky was a hard, bright, perfect blue over the desert. I do, she said when it was time. I do, he said. The legal process took time, as legal processes always do, but Solomon Fitch was as competent as he had represented himself. And the combination of the territorial court petition, the documentation of the marriage contract's fraudulent basis, and the testimony that Eudora, now legally Miriam Redmond, provided in careful written form, produced results over the course of the following months that were decisive if not swift. Robert Calloway, presented with a legal proceeding in a territory he had limited connections to, and with the information that his presumed dead wife had remarried in the Arizona territory, chose not to contest the process directly. His attorney sent a letter in June that was, between the formal language, essentially a withdrawal. Gideon read the final document 3 times before he was satisfied that it meant what it appeared to mean, and then he walked to the dry goods store where Miriam was working, and he came through the front door and said her name, her real name, quietly, and she looked up from the fabric she was cutting and read his face and set the scissors down and came around the counter, and he held up the document and she took it and read it, and when she looked up again, there were tears on her face and she was smiling. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She put her arms around his neck in the middle of Frank Aldridge's store on a Tuesday morning in June, and Gideon held her, and Frank Aldridge walked in from the back room, assessed the situation, and walked back out again with the decisive air of a man who has better things to do. Miriam Redmond began putting down roots with the particular intensity of a person who has been denied them for a long time and knows exactly how much they matter. She continued her work at the dry goods store and expanded it, taking on more commissions, developing a reputation across the county for quality that brought customers from the smaller settlements and the ranch homesteads. She became friends, genuine deep friends, with Clara Drummond and Margaret Price, and the 3 of them were a force in the life of Calico Bluffs in the way that competent women of strong opinions generally become a force in small communities. She learned the names and characters of every person in town within the first year, and she applied to all of them the same careful attention she applied to everything, so that she became, gradually and without calculation, one of those people whose presence in a community is so thoroughly woven in that the absence of it would be genuinely felt. She and Gideon had their difficulties, of course, because all people do, and because both of them were strong-willed and opinionated and accustomed to their own judgment, and because the process of building a shared life requires a great deal of negotiation and adjustment, and the willingness to be wrong and to say so. They argued sometimes, but not destructively, the way 2 people who respect each other argue, working toward the truth of something rather than toward victory. They went to bed having resolved what needed to be resolved, and they woke up, most mornings, lying in the same direction with the easy naturalness of people who have stopped being careful around each other and arrived somewhere better. Gideon was sitting on the porch of the house they had taken on the south edge of town, a small house with good light and a view of the hills, on an evening in the spring of 1881, when Miriam came to the door and stood there with a particular expression on her face that he had not seen before but recognized immediately in the instinctive way that he had always recognized things about her. He got up and went to her. "Miriam." She smiled, and it was a smile he had not seen before either, deeper than usual, with something underneath it that was not fully explainable in ordinary terms. "We are going to have a child," she said. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and felt the kind of feeling that does not have an ordinary name, the specific weight of a life expanding into a dimension you had not previously occupied, and he reached up and put his hand gently against her face, and she leaned into it, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment was large enough without words. "When?" he asked finally in a voice that was not entirely steady. "November, Dr. Hale thinks." He looked at her with all the feeling he had never been particularly skilled at expressing aloud, and he said, "Are you well? Are you happy?" "I am both," she said simply. He put both his arms around her and held her carefully as though being careful was the thing he could offer, and she said against his collar, quietly amused, "You can hold me normally, Gideon. I am not fragile." He held her more normally, and she laughed, and he felt the laugh against his chest, and thought that he was the luckiest man in 3 territories, possibly more. The autumn of 1881 in Calico Bluffs was warm and golden and full of ordinary good things. Dr. Theodore Hale had been practicing medicine in this territory for 5 years now and had developed into an excellent physician, and Miriam was in good health and good spirits, and when she was worried about something she said so, and when she was fine she said so, and Gideon found both equally reassuring because they were both real. The child arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of November. He was a boy, born before dawn in the blue-black quiet of the early morning, and he arrived with considerable determination and volume, and Dr. Hale said he was healthy and strong, and Miriam held him against her chest and looked at him with the focused, wondering attention of someone encountering something entirely new, and Gideon sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with his heart somewhere in his throat. "He looks like you," Miriam said. Gideon looked at the red, emphatically opinionated face of his son and said, "I'm not certain that's a compliment at this particular moment." She laughed, exhausted and beautiful and entirely herself. "It will be eventually." They named him James, after her father, because he had been gentle and somewhat bewildered by his remarkable daughter and had loved her thoroughly anyway, and because Miriam said she wanted the name to mean something good again. James Redmond was a loud, healthy, thoroughly opinionated infant who grew into a loud, healthy, thoroughly opinionated child, and in this he resembled both his parents so completely that it was difficult to say which side of the inheritance was responsible. Walt Coggins came to see the baby on a Wednesday afternoon, holding his hat in both hands and looking at the infant with the expression of a man who is considerably more emotionally affected than he intends to show. He said James looked like a fine boy. He said Gideon had done well. He patted Miriam's hand once and told her she was good for the town. These were, from Walt, declarations of profound feeling. Louis Garza brought Alina and the children, and Alina held James with the authority of a woman who had held many babies and knew exactly what she was doing, and James regarded her with solemn interest and then fell asleep, which she considered a success. Margaret Price arrived with a quilt she had made herself, which was beautiful and took up a good portion of the spare room. Clara Drummond arrived with food and a kind of proprietary satisfaction, as though this outcome had been produced by the natural order of things, and she had always known it would be. Life in Calico Bluffs moved in its rhythms. The seasons turned and the work went on, and the town grew slightly. A few new families settling, a new hardware store opening on the west end of the main street, the schoolhouse expanding to accommodate more children, the church adding a bell that Margaret Price complained about and Clara Drummond defended with equal conviction. Gideon was named sheriff when Walt Coggins retired in 1883, a decision that Walt had apparently made some time before he announced it, and that the town received with complete absence of surprise. Walt stayed in Calico Bluffs because he said the rest of the country did not appeal to him, and he spent his mornings fishing at the creek and his afternoons at the Red Saddle playing cards, with a dedication that suggested he had been waiting for years to have time for it. Miriam had expanded her work into a proper shop by 1883, a small storefront 2 doors from the dry goods store, where she employed 2 young women from the town and took commissions for everything from wedding dresses to riding clothes to the practical, beautiful everyday garments that the women of the territory actually needed and could afford. The shop was called simply Redmond's, and its reputation extended well past Calico Bluffs into the broader county. She ran it with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and the pleasure she took in the work was genuine and visible, the pleasure of a person doing what they do best in a place and with people they have chosen. She came home in the evenings to the house on the south edge of town, which they had expanded with a new room when James arrived, and again 2 years later when they found out there would be a second child. The second child arrived in the spring of 1884, another boy, who came into the world with slightly less drama than his brother but no less presence. They named him Walter, which made Walt Coggins, when he was told, put down his fishing rod and look at the creek for a full minute before turning around and saying, in a voice that was entirely steady, that he was honored. James and Walter Redmond grew up in a house where books were read aloud in the evenings and arguments were conducted with passion, and resolved with respect and honesty, was considered the only real social currency, and the work you did in the world was expected to be work you could be proud of. They grew up knowing that their mother had been braver than most people they would ever meet, and knowing their father's steadiness and his patience and the specific quality of his attention which made a person feel, when it was directed at them, as though they were truly and completely seen. Gideon was 42 years old when he and Miriam sat on the porch of their house one evening in the summer of 1890, the boys inside doing their homework with varying degrees of dedication, the desert light going amber and violet over the hills, the juniper trees dark against the fading sky. It was a Thursday evening that was in no other way remarkable, the kind of evening that makes up the substance of a life well lived, ordinary and warm and entirely sufficient. He was holding her hand. He did this often, without thinking about it, the easy comfort of it, the particular warmth of her hand in his that had been familiar to him for 10 years and still felt specifically good in a way that familiarity had not diminished. She was looking at the hills. She had a way of looking at landscape that he had always loved, with genuine absorption, as though the world was consistently interesting to her, which, as far as he could tell, it was. "Do you remember," she said, "that first morning in Clara's dining room?" "I remember everything about that morning," he said. She turned and looked at him with the particular expression she had for him, not the public face that was warm and capable and admired, but the private one, which was all of that and also entirely undefended, and which she gave to very few people and to him completely. "You said you were not my enemy in this. I remember. It was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in years," she said. "I had been my own only ally for so long that the idea of having someone on my side felt almost too large to understand." He turned her hand over in his and traced the familiar lines of it. "You have always been entirely capable of handling things yourself," he said. "I want you to know I know that." "I do know," she said, "but that is not the same as not wanting a partner." "No," he agreed, "it is not the same at all." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had, the same slight lean that she had offered that first evening on the hotel porch, which was 10 years old now and still had the same quality of trust in it. "I thought about this sometimes," she said quietly, "when things were very bad. I used to think about a particular passage in your letter, the one where you described the hills here. You said they looked ancient and patient, and that they made you feel that the world was larger than whatever problem you were currently facing." She paused. "I held on to that idea for a long time, the world being larger than the problem." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know you had read those letters so many times." "Many times," she said simply. "They were the only real thing I had for a while." He put his arm around her and she turned slightly into him, and they sat as the light went out of the sky over the hills, the stars coming in one by one as they always did, unhurried, the way the most certain things arrive. James came to the door behind them and announced that Walter had hidden his arithmetic book, which Walter disputed from within the house with considerable indignation, and Miriam lifted her head and raised her voice, and said that whoever had hidden the book should return it immediately, and that whoever was not doing their arithmetic should begin. And from inside there was a shuffling sound that suggested compliance. And she settled back against Gideon's shoulder, with the small, satisfied expression of a woman who has handled the situation efficiently and is now returning to more important matters. Gideon turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, and she made the small sound she made when she was comfortable and content. And outside, the first bat of the evening made its erratic flight across the purple sky, hunting, and somewhere down the creek. A frog began its one-note commentary on the evening, and the lamp inside the house threw its warm rectangle of light across the porch boards. He thought about the stagecoach pulling into Calico Bluffs on a Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1879, and the fine hairs on the back of his neck, and the door swinging open, and a woman in a blue dress stepping down into the red dust with a leather bag that was heavier than she made it appear, arriving under a borrowed name in a borrowed life, carrying all the weight of everything that had been done to her and everything she had done to survive it, and the way she had moved. The specific quality of it that was entirely hers, and that no amount of time or trouble or borrowed names could change. He had known her before she spoke. He had known her before she turned her face in his direction. Some things a person simply knows, in the quiet, reliable way that the body knows the temperature of water or the mind knows the rhythm of a familiar song, and the knowing precedes all explanation and does not require it. "Miriam," he said. She made a small questioning sound. "I would like you to know," he said, "that I have been glad every day." She lifted her head and looked at him, and in the last of the evening light her eyes were dark and warm and direct, and entirely without pretense, the eyes he had first known in Abilene in 1872 and had recognized across a dusty Main Street in 1879, and had looked into thousands of times since and never once found exhausted or ordinary. "Every day," she said. "Every single one," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then she smiled, a full and genuine smile that was entirely her own, and she said, "So have I." Inside the house, the lamp burned steadily, and the boys were conducting negotiations about the arithmetic book that had escalated into something more philosophical, and the night settled over Calico Bluffs in the reliable, patient way it always did, dark and star-scattered and enormous, the way the desert night always is, as though the world is making its nightly reminder that it is larger than any problem, any fear, any loss, any borrowed name or stolen year, larger than all of it. And that the space it offers is genuine and does not run out, that there is room enough and light enough for anyone willing to arrive and put down their bag and say, "Finally here, this is where I will stay." They sat on the porch until the night was fully dark and the stars were fully in, and the lamp inside had been turned down by James, who was responsible about lamps. And then they went inside to their home, to their sons and their books and their work and their ordinary, extraordinary life, and the door closed behind them with the quiet, definitive sound of something that is exactly where it is supposed to be.